The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with Anuj Desai, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. I'm really pleased to have back on the show Alfredo Pascual. Alfredo was on the show 9 months ago, I think, where we talked a bit about Germany. Alfredo is International Analyst for MJBizDaily and has recently produced a report called Medical Cannabis in Europe, which we're here to talk about today. Alfredo, how are you?
Hello, and I just double checked. It was 1 year ago exactly. So good timing. Yeah, good timing that I have the chance to speak with you again 1 year later and speak about what happened this past 12 months.
Yeah, perfect. I'm really glad to have you back in. You're doing some great work, as always, to bring some clarity to a very noisy industry. So thank you for that.
Thank you for your feedback.
No, pleasure. So let's jump straight into this, So for those that don't know, MJBizDaily is the premier business-to-business publication for the industry, I would say, mainly based in North America, but as a strong representation in Europe as well. And Alfredo has recently done a new report entitled Medical Cannabis in Europe, Markets and Opportunities. So we're here to discuss that today. Why don't we start with a really simple overview about what the report's about?
Yeah, sure. I think it would be useful to actually start with what the report is not about, to avoid any confusion. And I think that is important because when we speak about medical cannabis, different people might be thinking about different things. So it's good to be precise in this industry about what exactly we are talking about. So if you don't mind, I'll start telling you what's not about. And it's not about non-medical CBD markets in Europe, especially in the UK. As you know, CBD is largely freely sold in basically anywhere. That is not included in the report. CBD sales might be included if these are sold in a pharmacy under prescription, but not over-the-counter CBD. So that's a big part of the European cannabis ecosystem markets, obviously, but I decided not to include it exactly to avoid confusion. I wanted it to be about the purely medical markets, as in when a doctor prescribes a cannabis or cannabis-related product, and the patient goes to the pharmacy with the prescription and gets the product in the pharmacy. And the goal of the report, or at least one of the main objectives, was to estimate how much was sold as medical cannabis last year in Europe. So obviously then it also doesn't include non-commercial types of access to cannabis in Europe, like for example in Spain, where you have the cannabis social clubs, which are supposed to be non-profit and non-commercial type of access. That is not included, and obviously also no home growing, just the commercial and strictly medical sector.
Yeah, thank you for that, and really good to sort of highlight that fact. It's very interesting, actually. Maybe it's a sort of natural next step of the maturity of the whole industry, but starting to kind of separate things out in that way.
Yeah, and I think it's good to try to define things as precisely as possible and be on the same page in terms of what are we speaking about. And there's one more thing that the report is not about, and it is not about the potential size of the European markets. There are other good reports out there that estimate how much the markets would be like in 10 years or whatever they estimate. This is not what I try to do with this. With this, what I try to do is to take a picture of what happened in calendar year 2019. So the report is already history. It's about the past. It is intended to be just one of the many tools that companies and investors interested in the European medical cannabis markets should use to plan their business. And I think it is important, obviously, to have an estimate of how large you think the markets will be, but it is also important to know what happened last year. Because if you have no idea what happened last year, you're probably just making your plans based on wishful estimations, and those might be wrong. So yeah, it is intended to be a tool for companies and investors to know what happened in 2019 in terms of how much was sold in the main European markets. And also it tries to provide an overview and in some cases in detail of the regulations that allow these sales.
Thank you. So if for all those entrepreneurs out there looking to raise investment and put big numbers in their pitch decks, this isn't the report for you.
They are not, I mean, they are probably gonna like it internally because I think it's a great internal tool for companies to know where they are standing. They are probably not gonna use this report to create excitement among non-educated investors.
Sure. So, it's a good question then. Who is your main audience for this report? Both in terms of geography and the demographic. As we said, MJBiz comes from the US, and certainly is very focused on North America. Is it partially for that audience, or is it for mainly Europeans?
Not necessarily, because I think the report goes quite in depth. Like if you look, for example, at the German chapter, which is more than half of the report, I think it's hard or maybe even impossible to find any other report about Germany that goes into the details that I go in this one in terms of what are the regulations in Germany and what happened in 2019. So it is not a superficial thing of what's happening in Europe for people in North America to have an idea of what's going on. Actually, I think I try to focus on companies and investors that are already active in Europe or that are considering expanding into Europe. And obviously the audience is business and investors. It's not necessarily patients or medical scientists or plant scientists. It is about the markets and regulations in Europe. So it is intended to be used by mostly by companies and investors that want to understand better what is going on in the European medical cannabis markets. And look, from the feedback that I received, I think it was exactly well received among these people, because most of the feedback that I've received is of companies that either are already active in the European medical cannabis markets and are thankful to have more accurate information about what really happened in 2019. And also, to a lesser extent, I received actually a couple of emails from companies that so far haven't done anything related with cannabis, like for example a pharmaceutical company from Spain that was also thankful to have a better understanding of how the European medical cannabis markets are evolving. So this is a company, for example, that today has nothing to do with cannabis, but is eyeing what's going on. It's considering doing something in the medical cannabis sector, and obviously, yeah, they benefited from the report.
Great, really interesting, actually. Yeah. Okay, cool. Let's kick on and actually talk about the report. So before we get into some of the details, for the benefit of the audience, and obviously we'll provide links to the report afterwards, which I recommend that you all read. In it, you kind of talk a high level of an overview, but you dedicate chapters to certain countries. But it's interesting that you've only chosen a specific countries: Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Austria, and Czech Republic. What's the reason for that?
Yeah, there are also a couple of other countries, but as you correctly mentioned, these are the ones that I dedicate more space in the report, and particularly Germany. The reason is, so let's talk about how this idea evolved. This is the second edition. The first edition was published about a year ago. And when I was writing that first edition in early 2019, in the cannabis industry in general, there was a lot of excitement about new countries legalizing medical cannabis, even if it was with the main or even sole purpose of attracting foreign investment to cultivate for export only. So there's a bunch of countries in Europe and also outside of Europe that even today have zero patients, or maybe only patients that exceptionally access to Sativex or some other cannabis-based medicine, but that haven't really developed an internal medical cannabis market, and all they've done is to try to attract companies to go grow there and then export. And obviously there's nothing wrong with that, but today the industry is somewhat different. After the exuberance of 2018 and early 2019 is over, and now what companies in the industry are really interested in is not if one more country allows them to go there and invest a few millions in one more grow facility. What they are interested in is in where can they actually sell medical cannabis? Where are the revenue opportunities? And that's the focus of the report. So, for instance, you won't see much in the report about Portugal, Greece, or Cyprus, just to mention a few examples. And the reason is that these countries today have very few or even zero patients. So these countries technically legalize medical cannabis. They have some framework that would allow access, or in the case of Cyprus, they might even already have some access. But truth is that there's no real market there. And in the case of Portugal and Greece, for example, their focus has been so far mostly on attracting companies to set up their cultivation facilities there to export. So the report is not about how to get a license in one of these countries to grow. The report is about where can you sell medical cannabis in Europe, and especially focus on the largest markets, and especially Germany, because Germany was in 2019, and I bet still is today, larger than all the other European countries combined when we see the actual retail value of the medical cannabis market.
Yeah. And again, another signifier of slight maturing of how we analyze these things. So that's good to understand that. So, yeah, I mean, as I said, we're going to provide links to the report for people to dig into the detail themselves. But are you able to give us a kind of very high level overview of some of the things that you discovered as part of the report?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that the most attention I would say of the report is the number of how large the market is. It's like what everyone wants to know first. And the estimation that I did after researching all these countries where there are meaningful sales of medical cannabis in Europe was that in 2019, so already history again, it's good to emphasize, in 2019, the European market was about 250 million euros. And that only tells a very only a part of the picture, because it is important to go into more detail. And when you go into more detail, you see that over 70% of those 250 million are represented by Germany. Germany is by far the largest country, the largest market in Europe when we talk about medical cannabis. And it's followed very far away by Italy, and then other smaller markets like Austria, the Netherlands, and Switzerland and Denmark. And then anything else in Europe in 2019 was tiny. Tiny as in less than 100 kilograms of flower in the whole year. So yeah, it is important to note that the size of the European market, I mean, I do it because it is a report about Europe, but if we want to be precise, there's no European market. And you've talked about this with me and also with other speakers that you've had in your show about how Europe is not a single market when it comes to medical cannabis, and it is a country by country thing. And when we see country by country, we see huge differences, and especially the fact that Germany is by far the largest market in Europe, followed far away by the others. So that's, I would say, one of the main takeaways. So how much was sold in 2019, which was one of the, as I mentioned before, main objectives of the report.
And Alfredo, just very quickly, just in terms of context, so 250 million, just in terms of context, and in the report you obviously acknowledge how difficult it is to estimate. Do you have a broad global figure as well to sort of, put that 250 million against what it is across the world?
Well, I mean, depends what you compare it with. If you compare it, for example, with Latin America, and the Latin America report will be published in a couple of months, it is a lot, because sales in Latin America in 2019 were non-existent in most countries, not in all of them, but in most countries. So again, it might be a lot compared with Latin America, but if we compare it with North America, which is the region of the world where cannabis markets are generally more developed, what we see is that in 2019, Europe wasn't that big. For example, it was less than half the sales of certain US states that only have medical markets, like, for example, Arizona. Only the state of Arizona, which isn't like a state that companies in the US are very excited about, because it's not a big market. It's not like California or Colorado. It's medical and relatively small. But still, only Arizona in the US was larger than the whole of Europe in 2019. But again, it's important to say that this is speaking about the past, about 2019. And I think an important thing of Europe, its current very, very strong growth trend and potential, right? So Europe is a massive continent with several 100 million population. And also, especially because of growth in Germany, it is growing rapidly. So, in terms of growth, also it is important to mention that growth is different when you see different countries. Like the good thing is that the largest market in Europe, Germany, it's also one of the markets that is growing more rapidly, basically doubling year after year since 2017. So that is great because it means that then Europe as a whole is also growing rapidly. And the second largest market, Italy, it also had double-digit growth in 2019 over 2018. So that is also very positive. But it's important to mention, and it's also one of the takeaways of the report, that exponential growth and these predictions that after cannabis law is approved, then we will just see unstoppable exponential growth forever, that is just wishful thinking. Because if you see real life examples, and I'm talking about certain European examples, we see that that is not always the case. So, for example, you can take a look at the Netherlands, which is the most mature market in Europe in a way, and sales in the Netherlands have been relatively stable since 2017, going up and down maybe 5% a year. So they got stuck there, and it's not a huge market. It's I think it was 580 kilograms of flour or flour used as, to prepare oil that was sold in 2019, and it's been like that for the past 3 years basically. So it's not growing exponentially anymore. Or if you see Denmark throughout 2019, you see that it was growing rapidly during the first half, but then when we talk about the pilot project in Denmark, which is what started in 2019, the products in the pilot project, sales of those products, what we see is that in the second half of 2019, sales went down drastically. And there are explanations for that. But what I mean with this is exponential growth is not guaranteed.
Yeah. Particularly, I suppose, when you're starting from a low starting point, the trajectory at the beginning is going to be kind of exponential, and at some point it starts to become more normal.
That is true, and that is also important. I always emphasize when we talk about growth of the medical cannabis market to say, okay, it's growing from what, right? Because even if I don't know, if you jump from the bottom of the ocean, no matter how high you jump, you're probably still gonna be below the water level, right?
Yeah.
So it is important to know what's the starting point, and that's also one of the objectives of these reports, to start generating some history, some historical data, which is obviously hard because data is not perfect, and I have to do some estimates, and I'm no way saying that this is the perfect estimation, but it is at least an honest estimation of the European medical cannabis market, and it starts to generate some data that with the years we'll be able to understand better.
Yeah, fantastic. So, look, I mean, you're in a great place to observe this, and I'm not sure if it's the best way to ask the question, but did 2019 turn out better or worse than you predicted, or how did it, shape up in comparison to 2018?
Well, again, I would say that 2019 was a great year for Europe. And you see nowadays that there are many companies and investors that are quite disappointed at how things are evolving in Europe because they were expecting these multi-billion markets that still haven't materialized. So there's a bunch of people that are now negative about Europe. And I ended up being the positive guy because I'm saying that it was a great year for Europe in 2019 because basically the largest markets doubled or at least had double-digit growth. And where else do you see that? In which industry do you see that type of growth? So the first thing is that it was great for Europe, basically because of the growth in Germany and Italy. The second thing is that, so when you ask me if it is as expected or not, I would say it is largely as expected. And if you see the first edition of the European report, for example, in that one, I tried to, for instance, predict the growth in Italy. And if you then see how much was sold in Italy, it was a difference of 50 kilograms, for example. And why is that relatively easy to predict in the case of Italy, for example? Well, because what's sold in Italy, it's the vast majority of it is an agreed quantity between the Italian and Dutch government, which is known beforehand. So you know that by the end of the year, unless something drastic changes, and the quantities that the Netherlands will ship to Italy will be the ones agreed. And a tiny part of the Italian market is supplied by the army growing locally and the army buying from Canadian licensed producer, according to a previously already done application process. So it's relatively easy to predict how much is going to be sold in Italy in the next year, or the current year at least. And yeah, that's what happened. And I think it is important for companies to try to remain realistic about these things and not just believe in exponential growth that it's going to happen automatically.
Yeah. That's great summary. And in terms of the sort of high level numbers, there's plenty of detail in the report. Maybe if we can dip into the actual sort of qualitative stuff that sits behind it in terms of maybe the trends, etc. Isolated cannabinoids as a medicine, is that a bit more important in Europe than it is in North America? Are you seeing any of these sort of trends emerging in terms of what patients are actually getting, or maybe even what they're asking for?
Yeah. So we can go back to flower then, and I can give you an overview of the flower numbers in Europe, because flower still remains hugely important in the main European markets. It is hugely important, at least half of the market in Germany, almost all of the market in Italy and the Netherlands. But clarifying that in Italy and the Netherlands, that flower is not generally, but often processed in the pharmacy, at the pharmacy level, into oils or different types of extract. But flower and full spectrum extracts are super important in these three markets. But there's something that, at least until recently, was largely ignored, and probably ignored because of in many ways, North American origin or focus of the industry, North American companies coming to Europe or North American investors coming to Europe. And what has been largely ignored so far is the role that dronabinol plays in Europe, or to say it in other words, pure THC. And with this, I mean the THC molecule isolated and not full spectrum extracts that might have some of the other cannabinoids present in the plants and maybe terpenes and other stuff. This is just pure THC. And this is, in North America, relatively unimportant. And I emphasize relatively because there are FDA-approved drugs that have dronabinol as the active ingredient, such as Marinol and Syndros. But when we talk about medical cannabis in the US and in Canada, normally we are not referring to these two medicines. We are referring to the medical cannabis that is being grown and sold in the dispensaries, right? Or in Canada, not in the dispensaries, but you get what I mean.
Sure.
In Europe, dronabinol plays a huge role because in Germany, which is the largest European market, dronabinol is at least 30% of the reimbursed market. So it is a large section of the market. And this dronabinol, it is also important to emphasize, unlike the FDA-approved medicines, Syndros and Marinol, that have synthetic dronabinol, in the case of Europe, most of it, the vast majority of it, is not produced synthetically. It is plant-derived. So there's a company in Germany called Bionorica that imported flower for many years and produced the pure THC in Germany. And that company sold its cannabis division to Canopy Growth last year in what was probably the largest European acquisition in the cannabis industry. And now it's part of Canopy Growth. So the Canadian producer, Canopy Growth, now owns these two facilities. One of these two facilities is a very small one, and they can produce synthetic THC and CBD, but the other one produces it from flower. And it is an important part of the market in Germany. And until April this year, as far as I know, the only company that was producing THC, pure THC for the German market was this one. There was no other competitor in that category. While when you see flower, for example, there are now several competitors trying to get a share of the flower market. And then dronabinol is important not only in Germany, but also in Austria, where it's basically all of the Austrian market, almost all of it is dronabinol, because there are no sales of full spectrum extracts or flower. It is not allowed in Austria. And then it's a big part of the market in Switzerland and Denmark. And by the way, remember when I told you that things in Denmark started to go south in the second half of 2019 in the domestic Danish market? One of the main explanations was that until about mid-2019, the only full spectrum oils that were available were imported from Canada. but the company that was exporting the oils to Denmark, because of non-compliance issues with Health Canada, had to stop sending those oils to Denmark, and then Danish patients had no access to full spectrum oils anymore. The only other full spectrum product that they had available was bedrocan flowers imported from the Netherlands. And it was interesting because what you see that happened after no full spectrum oils were available anymore in Denmark was that there was a big growth in dronabinol sales, so isolated THC, but only a very tiny growth of flower sales, or even stable, I would say. So what that indicates, at least at first sight, that indicates that patients that were using full spectrum oil switched to pure THC instead of switching to flower, or at least their doctors prescribe them dronabinol instead of flower. So yeah, in a nutshell, it plays a big role, at least in Central Europe.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, virtually everything you say, we could do a show on, an individual show on. So I'm choosing what to drill down on. One of the things that you said, which was very interesting, is around the role that pharmacies play. And again, it could be a very long answer, but how active a role do pharmacies play? Because, to many people, they may just assume that they take delivery of a cannabis product, a medical cannabis product, and simply just distribute it to people with prescriptions. However, what you were alluding to there is that actually they take on a fairly meaningful processing role as well in some cases. Are you able to sort of elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, and again, it could be a topic for a complete show. But let's talk about the three largest markets in Europe, at least when it comes to flower or full spectrum products. In the case of Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands, pharmacies play a central role, and for many reasons. So one is that when we speak about Germany or Italy, for example, cannabis is normally sold as a magistral preparation or extemporaneous mixture, or however you want to call it. But what it means is that it is a prescription that is supposed to be individualized for a specific patient, and that the pharmacist will prepare a preparation according to that prescription. So the pharmacist is using the medical cannabis that the pharmacy buys as some sort of raw material for a preparation. And that means they play a big role. First, because when we look at the price of medical cannabis, at least in Germany and Italy, in the Netherlands, it is not as extreme. But in Germany and Italy, simplifying, you could say half of the price of medical cannabis remains in the pharmacy. And why is that? Well, basically because they're doing this preparation. They are not just receiving a finished product and then selling it to the patient just like that. Or they need to actually prepare something. Whether what they prepare is a complex process or not, that's another issue, and it's specific to the prescription, and it changes country by country again. But at least theoretically, pharmacists are making a preparation in the pharmacy, and with that, they are adding a big markup. So that it is important to note, because when we talk about the size of the European medical cannabis markets and we talk about the retail size, we are including the pharmacy's markup, obviously, and it needs to be included. But it is important to know for investors that that price is not going to the grower, right? It is staying at the pharmacy level. And unlike Canada, for example, in Germany, there are no pharmacy chains. So a licensed producer cannot buy thousands of pharmacies or make an agreement even with thousands of pharmacies in Germany like they could do in Canada, for example. And that is because basically in Germany, you cannot own more than a couple of pharmacies. So that is important. And it is important because they could be a bottleneck if not enough pharmacies were willing to prepare these products. Like, for example, in the case of Italy, I'm not saying it is a bottleneck, but it could be a bottleneck, because in the case of Italy, when a doctor prescribes an oil, for example, to keep it simple, but it could be even a cream, then it is the pharmacist that is supposed to prepare it. And the pharmacist is not preparing it with a raw extract or something like that. The pharmacist is preparing that with the flower. So the whole process of preparing that magistral preparation at the pharmacy level is done from the flower until the final product that the patient is receiving. And obviously for that, you need education, special equipment, and everything else.
Yeah, I was going to say, so clearly that's a certain skill set that not all pharmacists, in fact, I would imagine very few pharmacists have. So, there's all that sort of training that needs to happen. What's the thought process behind it in the first place that it has to happen from flower, but only the pharmacist can do it?
Again, we need to speak country by country. And in the case of Germany, for example, cannabis is both a medicine and a narcotic. And it's not, I mean, if you see the German medical cannabis law, it's interesting because it's one of the simplest laws, medical cannabis laws in the world, I would say. It's very short. And with this, I mean not the medical cannabis law, but the amendments that were done in the year early 2017 and that entered into place in March 2017. I don't want to overly simplify it, but in a nutshell, what Germany did was to say magistral preparations of cannabis now are both medicine and narcotic. And that looks simple, but it's not so simple because then you need to understand the German Medicines Act and the German Narcotics Act. So it looks simple, but then you need to go to other legislation to understand how the regulations work. And basically what that means is that it can only be sold in pharmacies. It's not like in North America or many places in North America where producers can sell to patients. That is a no-go in Germany because, it is the pharmacy role to sell medicines to patients. It is not the role of buyer to sell the medicines to the patients.
Yeah. Again, I'm probably sure there's about 50 questions I could ask you on that again as a follow-up. But, you're conscious of time. One of the things that I picked up on, which I think you probably alluded to in your previous answer just now, but when you talk about retail estimates, the price per gram in euros seems to be significantly less in the Netherlands than Germany, Italy, and the others, and, roughly 3 times less. What's the reason behind that?
Couple of reasons, and again, for the sake of time, I need to simplify a little bit. But so one reason is that the way the markup works in the Netherlands is very different than that in Germany and Italy. Basically, in the Netherlands, pharmacies sell medical cannabis flower at least for the same price that they buy it, and they add like a fixed fee per prescription that depends on whether it's the first prescription or a renewal. So that means that there are not many middlemen because all cannabis flower sold in the Netherlands is grown in the Netherlands.
Right.
It is sold by the company that grows it, Betrocan, to the government. And then the government has a markup there, but it's to cover the costs, basically. And then it sells it to the pharmacies through a distributor that it has. So it is relatively simple from grow to patient. While in the case of Germany and Italy, for example, and let's focus on Germany, the cannabis flower that is sold to patients is at least until the end of the year, not grown in Germany. It is all imported. And there are more middlemen. So you have the grower either in the Netherlands or in Canada. Then you have the exporter that might be the same as the grower in Canada, but in the case of the Netherlands, it's the government. Then you have the importer in Germany, and then the importer might sell it to another wholesaler in Germany or might sell it to the pharmacy, and then the pharmacy ends up doing another big markup, and that makes it more expensive.
Everyone's taking their slice. Okay, cool.
But it's also interesting to note in the report that is also one of the reasons why I always say that it's important to precisely define what we're talking about. And sometimes you hear some companies or investors talk about the price of medical cannabis in Germany, for example, being super high, which means margins are great. I mean, depends what you compare it with as usual, but it also depends what precisely are you speaking about. Is it the price at the pharmacy after all these markups, or is it the price at which the domestic growers in Germany will sell it to the government? Another takeaway of the report is that, generalizing a little bit, when you see the tenders, the supply tenders in Europe, be it in Germany, Italy, or the Netherlands, what you see is that the companies that win these contracts to supply the government usually offer medical cannabis flower for about €2 a gram. And it can be 170, it can be 250, depending on the specific application process we're talking about and the specific country. But simplifying a little bit, you can say that in the past year or so, the main application processes or tenders in Europe to supply medical cannabis flower, grow it and supply medical cannabis flower, tend to have a price around 2 euros per gram, which is very different than the 20 euro a gram that is currently being sold in German pharmacies. And by the way, again, it could be a topic for another session, but prices in Germany, even at a retail level, are also coming down. And that is because of a recent agreement between pharmacies and insurers.
Right. Yes. Huge amounts there, but brilliant kind of summary and overview. And again, I will really invite everyone to have a look at that report to get a bit more detail. I think one of the so my last question will be, and it's an area that I'm just personally really interested in, this is the idea of flower versus extracts in the medical sphere. What are your kind of views and insights on that kind of makeup of the market, and how is that shifting?
I guess both have their place, flower and extracts, because they have different advantages and disadvantages, right?
Yeah. But I guess it was more in terms of the trends of
got it.
what are people prescribing, and maybe what are patients and doctors demanding.
Yeah. So again, it's hard to reply to that in a minute, and as usual, it is important to mention specifically about which country and so where are we talking about and at what time, right? But if you see, for example, the German market in 2019 and the estimates in the report, you can see that most of the market was flower. Definitely more than half of the market was flower that is sold either as the whole flower at the pharmacy level, or it's grinded, milled by the pharmacist, or already milled by the producer in the case of a couple of varieties. Then there's dronabinol that I mentioned, pure THC, also with sometimes pure CBD, but not full spectrum extracts. This is just the two molecules or one of the two molecules, and imagine an oil that is in Germany about 30% of the market. And then what's left, it's mostly Sativex, which is a registered medicine with marketing authorization. So what this means is that it's sold like any other medicine, and I'd still consider it medical cannabis because it's obviously a cannabis-derived medicine, but it has certain, let's say, privileges that go beyond those of medical cannabis. For example, that if it is prescribed for the condition that it's registered, that it has its marketing authorization, then it's not needed to do an application to get reimbursement. That is automatic. And then there's full spectrum extracts that in Germany in 2019 at least were about 5% of the total reimbursed market. Why that? It is hard to explain in a rush. And I don't have the perfect explanation as well. I have certain hypotheses of why that could be the case. And one of the reasons is that in Germany, there's, I would say, a long tradition of prescribing dronabinol. We go again to pure THC. And I say this because I think the first prescriptions of dronabinol were done at the end of the 90s, so like 20 years ago. And obviously, that was a super exceptional thing. I'm not talking about the generalized access to pure THC in the 90s. But what I mean with this is that long before the change of the law in 2017, doctors and patients, at least some doctors and some patients, were used to dronabinol prescriptions. And full spectrum extracts were something new that came for the first time in 2017 at a relatively high price and without much variety. So I would say at least part of the explanation is, you could say, tradition, that doctors and patients were used to dronabinol before the entrance of full spectrum extracts in the market, and also that the company that had been offering the dronabinol to the German market until its cannabinoid division was bought by Canopy Growth was a company that basically everyone in Germany knows, because it's a pharmaceutical company that not only had dronabinol as one of its products, but also a bunch of other products that everyone in Germany knows. And it is hard not to know that someone in Germany doesn't know about this company. So it's a trusted mainstream company, that it was never like a cannabis company, which means that I would assume that for most doctors, or at least these doctors that are somewhat unwilling to prescribe cannabis, they probably have more confidence in a mainstream pharmaceutical company than in a newcomer from North America. And things might have changed by now, but at least when the law changed, that was the situation. And that probably explains why pure THC is so popular in Germany and full spectrum extracts aren't. But look, this is just one possible explanation. There might be other explanations, like what's the role of full spectrum extracts when you already have pure THC and CBD, and someone might argue the entourage effect and all of that. But yeah, that's always something up for debate in the medical community. And
let's just say more research is needed.
Always.
always. Okay, look, Alfredo, this is just brilliant as always. You're a font of a huge amount of knowledge, and we could talk for a lot longer, but I'm conscious that we probably need to bring it to a close. I would love to get you on again, and maybe we can elaborate on one or two of these topics and go a bit deeper.
Yeah, it feels like we miss speaking about a bunch of other important issues. But yeah, happy to come again, speak again another time.
Yeah, let's do that. Cool. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks to you as always.
Cheers.